This month's theme is the Sacred Continuum, and today's topic is living from spirit every moment. I'm sure some of you, at least some of you, like me, remember a song that Frank Sinatra sang a number of years ago titled, "I Did It My Way." Well, he may have had an exclusive on that particular song for many years, but in fact, the concept of doing it my way goes clear back to biblical times. Actually, today I want to share with you 3 stories of victory based on doing it your way. And 2 of them are stories that have been passed down through history in the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament. And these are stories that give us insight into how we can rise above the adversities that present themselves for us to deal with actually pretty much on a daily basis in this thing called life. The first story is from the Old Testament. When the Israelites left Egypt back so many centuries ago in the story, after having created some real grief for the Pharaoh and his people, they certainly did it their way. You may remember from the story of their departure that they were able to get away from the Pharaoh's army because the Red Sea is reputed to have parted in order to let them pass. And as soon as they were safely across, the sea was said to have closed behind them so that no pursuing army could follow them. Now, how many times has that happened in history? Even in story form. Certainly that was a case of doing it your way, right? The second story is that of Jesus' life and teachings in the New Testament. Contained within this story, there is dramatic evidence that he also did it his way. Certainly the triumphant entry into Jerusalem on the day dubbed Palm Sunday was an example of victory, as well as the story of his having overcome physical death. Now, let me share with you the words of Charles Fillmore, who was the founder of the Unity movement here in the United States some years back, as he talks about the story of Jesus. Fillmore says, "He was more than any other person who had walked or lived on the earth before his time, because there came into his humanhood a factor to which most people were strangers." You notice that I said, who had lived on earth before his time, because there's been a lot of time since then, and we've seen a lot of this unfolding in that time. But this factor that Fillmore talks about is the Christ consciousness unfolding. The unfolding of this consciousness is the mind of God individualized. Fillmore says, in a case like this, we can't tell where the person leaves off and God begins in such a consciousness. And, Fillmore went on, Jesus was able to eventually drop the personal consciousness by which we separate ourselves from our true God itself. Jesus became consciously one with the absolute principle of being. Yet, I want to tell you today that Jesus also did it his way. Yet he attained no more than what can be expected and attained by every one of us. The Christ consciousness is in you, and that is that same divine potential that is expressed by those like Jesus, but not only by Jesus. So, you see, it's really important that we make a clear distinction between Jesus the person and the Christ consciousness. Or we miss the purpose and the point of his life story. Jesus didn't come to save the world en masse. I'm sure you already knew that. The story of Jesus is a story designed to teach people one by one how to find that indwelling Christ consciousness and to walk by its light, thereby making their own rise in consciousness a personal experience. In the Bible, that's called salvation. But what that means is taking charge of your own life, progressively releasing your own God potential. That's the victory. And each one of us individually becomes the victor as we do that. Jesus is the story of a revealer of truth of each person's divinity. Our redemption, if you choose to call it such, is our recognition of that divinity through the positive changing of our own self-image. It's always an individual revelation of truth, and its reward is what Jesus called the life more abundant. This Christ principle is the whole person in each one of us. In the words of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." His meaning there is that the kingdom is your potential for fulfillment, and the will is the cosmic force working to reveal it. It's an extension of you, not some external plan being forced upon you. It's your truth. It's your reality, your wholeness. It's your victory. So in each of those two stories, there is the theme of victory overcoming adversity. And that's the message for today. Accepting victory. Always being a victor in the experiences of our lives. The third story is much more contemporary. It's the story of a man named Walt Jones who lived in Tacoma, Washington. Walt outlived 3 wives, the third one to whom he was married for 52 years. When she died, a friend commented to him that it must be sad losing such a longtime friend. And Walt responded, "Well, of course it was. But then again, maybe it's for the best." "Well, why is that?" his friend asked. And Walt replied that he didn't want to be negative or defame her wonderful character, but she had really pooped out on him in the last decade. He went on to explain that she never wanted to do anything, she just got to be a stick in the mud. 10 years ago, he said, when I turned 94, I told her we had never been anywhere and that I was thinking of buying a motorhome so that we could visit all 48 of the contiguous states. She told me I was out of my mind. And besides, she said, who would I ever get to drive us? Well, I told her I'd drive it myself. And then she really got upset and said I'd kill us both. So Walt's friend kind of laughed about that and said, well, so now that she's gone, Walt, what do you intend to do? He said, I buried the old gal and bought myself a motorhome. I'm on my way to the lower 48. Well, Walt hadn't had his motorhome but a few months when he was seen driving around with an attractive woman in her 60s at his side. When asked about that, he said, well, man cannot live in a motorhome alone. Even at 104 years of age, he wanted somebody to talk to. So in 1978, at the age of 106, Walt was a major investor in a condominium development. When asked why he was taking his money out of a secure bank account and putting it into property development, he replied this: "Haven't you heard? These are inflationary times. You've got to put your money into real property so that it will appreciate and be around for your later years when you really have need of it." 2 years later, he sold off part of that property and took back a 30-year mortgage. He commented proudly, "I've got $4,000 a month coming in until I'm 138 years old." Now, you may think this is a made-up story until you hear the next paragraph. He celebrated his 110th birthday on the Johnny Carson show. When Carson remarked that Walt was within 3 days of being twice Carson's age, Walt challenged him with, "How old would you be if you didn't know the date you were born, and there was no calendar to depress you every year? Too many people get depressed because of calendars." "Johnny," Walt said, "who says you're supposed to roll over and die when you're 55? I have friends who have become more prosperous after they turned 75 than they ever were before. And as a result of a condo investment that I made a few years ago, I've made more money since I turned 105 than I did in all my years before then." Walt Jones was a man who remained vitally alive and growing every day of his life. He invited victory into the experiences of his life and accepted it by showing up for them. Wouldn't you say he certainly did it his way? The Christ consciousness is the God self of each one of us that is always present, it's always active, it's always seeking to fulfill itself in you and in me. How fascinating and varied are the ways that it shows up in just the right moment in us. It's the whole of divine mind at the point of oneness with your mind. It's victory. It's in revealing itself that the victory takes place. And that is in the whole body of your affairs, including, not limited to, your physical body, but the body of your affairs, your prosperity, your creativity, your relationships. It's all part of the one. The story of Jesus is the story of one who understood this process, and his life was a tribute to its effectiveness. He was not one in whom God specialized, but one who specialized in God. He did this through effort, through discipline, and through affirmative acceptance, just as we do. Careful and objective study of the original texts, not twisted and obscured by inaccurate translations, but accurate and careful translations, reveal that all of Jesus' prayers were actually affirmative. The story of Jesus moving into the Christ consciousness is what Eric Butterworth calls the cosmic counterpart. The story of Jesus is the story of a person who demonstrated what any of us can and do and be when we concentrate our spiritual energies. It reminds us that there is always enough power within us to accomplish whatever we need. Too much attention has been given to Jesus' divinity down through the ages, and not enough to his humanity. What the story of Jesus did, or was meant to do, was to discover the divine depth as a potential within all people. The famous quote, which even religious scientists don't edit. The famous quote, "All that I have done and even greater things you can do." And the I am concept, meaning our realization that we are one with our divine creator, this I am has never meant to be an obscure one, to become so lost and to give rise to what has become a very confusing concept of the divinity of Jesus. Science of mind teaches that Jesus was the great example, not the great exception. And our philosophy believes that the birth of the Christ consciousness begins when any heart is spiritually impregnated with the Christ consciousness. The truth of what is sometimes called the Holy Spirit is revealed to us through our conscious mind and gives us the strength to be unafraid to trust the feelings of love. What a victory is ours when we can trust love. Christ consciousness brings us empowerment to do spiritual works. What a victory that is when our lives embrace that God consciousness is in every thought, every day, every action. So stir up that gift of God within you, that spirit through every moment in your life. Be willing to recognize that the Christ power and potential is within your very self. Allow yourself to sing your song. Do it your way, which of course is the way of God by means of you. Allow yourself to be victorious by rising above whatever has kept you from your good. You don't have to lead the Israelites out of Egypt, that's already been done, or start a new religious teaching to be victorious in life, because you're in the midst of one. Like Walt Jones, you and I can find ways in today's world to feel worthwhile, to feel satisfied, and to demonstrate the power and the potential within us. We can do this by enjoying life and by offering that same enjoyment to those around us. There is great joy as the whole of your being celebrates and ascends to new, greater experiences. And as your human faculties are spiritualized, they're raised from a sense consciousness to a Christ consciousness. This transformation of our consciousness is the real meaning of the word transformation and living from spirit every moment. It's the realization that our mind, our body, our soul or essence, all of these are being raised by they are being raised from a sense consciousness to a spiritual consciousness. So I invite you to see these possibilities this week, to realize the power that you can demonstrate living in this sacred continuum. And so it is.